We're about to get into some of the most difficult moments in U.S. military history. Now, this isn't about judging the past from the comfort of today. Instead, we're going to dig into the facts. What actually happened, what systems allowed it to happen, and, what surprising patterns start to show up when you look at it all together.
This quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of the matter. It tells us that the real story isn't about a few bad apples. No, it's about the policies, the pressures, and the cultures inside institutions that can push ordinary people to do absolutely terrible things. This is a story of systems, not monsters.
So, let's be clear, what exactly is a war crime? It's not just any awful thing that happens during a war. It's a very specific violation of international laws like the Geneva Conventions. We're talking about things like deliberately targeting civilians, torture, or using completely disproportionate force. And here's the crucial part. These acts are judged based on the laws and the knowledge that was available at the time they were committed. That's key.
All right, let's start our journey back at the turn of the 20th century. This period covers America's first major colonial war overseas and the massive global conflict that would literally redefine the rules of war forever.
So after the Spanish-American War, Filipino revolutionaries were expecting independence, but instead they got U.S. occupation. And what followed was just a brutal counterinsurgency campaign where, thanks to imperial logic, the lines between who was a soldier and who was a civilian became dangerously blurry.
I mean, listen to this. The command from General Jacob Smith was shockingly explicit. Kill anyone capable of bearing arms. And on the ground, his men took that to mean any male over the age of 10. This wasn't some kind of battlefield confusion. This was a direct order that led to the widespread slaughter of civilians.
So what happened to him? What was the accountability for an order like that? Well, Smith was court-martialed, sure, but he was never imprisoned. He was simply forced to retire. And right here, we see a theme that's going to come up again and again. A huge gap between how bad the act was and the actual consequence for the person in command.
Okay, fast forward to World War II. That number you see, 100,000? That's the estimated number of civilians who died from the U.S. firebombing of Tokyo. And that was in a single night. This wasn't a precision strike, it was what you'd call area destruction. It was a strategy aimed at shattering Japan's industrial capacity and civilian morale by just leveling entire cities.
Now this is where you run into a really complex legal reality. At the time, there were no specific international laws that explicitly outlawed strategic bombing or atomic weapons. Legally, it was a gray area. But the sheer horror of these campaigns, from Tokyo to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, directly led to the creation of the modern humanitarian laws we have today. Their legacy was to make damn sure that actions like that would be illegal in the future.
Now, let's move into the 1960s. The Vietnam War. This marks a really disturbing evolution. Because here, war crimes became less about isolated incidents and more about the direct result of systemic, top-down policy failures.
This is the estimated number of unarmed civilians. We're talking women, children, even infants, murdered by U.S. soldiers in a little village called My Lai on March 16, 1968. It was a flat-out massacre, one that the military initially covered up. It only came to light because of whistleblowers more than a year later.
So, for one of the worst, most infamous atrocities in U.S. military history, what was the consequence? Well, accountability basically stopped at the bottom. Out of all the men who were charged, only one junior officer was ever convicted. His life sentence was eventually cut down to just 3.5 years of house arrest. Not a single senior officer was ever held criminally responsible.
But why did My Lai happen? As investigators found out, it wasn't random at all. It was the predictable result of a broken system. See, the military's #1 metric for success was the body count, which created a terrible incentive to just kill. You combine that with policies like free-fire zones, where anyone could be treated as an enemy combatant, and you basically created an environment where a massacre wasn't just possible, it was tragically inevitable.
And make no mistake, My Lai was not some isolated incident, not by a long shot. During an operation called Speedy Express, military reports were showing these huge enemy kill counts, but they were finding almost no captured weapons. A secret internal Pentagon investigation later concluded that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. And yet, no one was ever prosecuted.
And that brings us to the modern era. Now, unlike some of the legal ambiguities of World War II, the conduct we're about to discuss was explicitly illegal under well-established international and U.S. law at the time it happened. There was no gray area here. In 2004, the world saw those shocking, unforgettable photographs from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. They documented systemic abuse and torture of detainees. We're talking about sexual humiliation, severe physical abuse, placing hoods on prisoners, threatening them with dogs. This wasn't just the work of a few rogue soldiers. It was a clear pattern of behavior.
And the accountability? Well, it followed that same old, familiar pattern. A handful of low-ranking soldiers went to prison. But the senior officials who authorized these so-called enhanced interrogation techniques and the lawyers who literally wrote the memos trying to justify them, they faced no criminal charges. None. It was a clear-as-day two-tiered system of justice.
A year later, in Haditha, Iraq, a roadside bomb killed one U.S. Marine. In the hours that followed, other Marines went on to kill 24 unarmed Iraqi civilians in their own homes, including women and children. The initial military report, it claimed they died in a firefight with insurgents. That story, as it turned out, was completely false.
So, despite having clear evidence of a massacre, the legal process just fell apart. Charges against most of the Marines were dropped. Of the 8 who were originally charged, only 1 was convicted, and that was on a minor charge for dereliction of duty. No one was ever convicted of murder.
This whole problem of accountability takes on a totally new form with modern drone warfare. Now, targeted strikes themselves aren't necessarily illegal. The problem is the extreme secrecy around the program. It means that when civilians are killed, maybe because of bad intelligence or a case of mistaken identity, holding anyone legally accountable becomes structurally almost impossible.
So, after looking at all these cases, from the Philippines to Vietnam to Iraq, we see this clear, undeniable pattern emerging. And that leads to the final question. Why? Why does this accountability gap keep happening? Well, there are several huge structural barriers. First off, the U.S. refuses to join the International Criminal Court, which shields its citizens from any outside prosecution. Second, investigations are internal, which means the military controls the evidence and gets to shape the narrative. And finally, there's just immense political resistance to prosecuting senior officials, which basically insulates the architects of these policies from ever facing the consequences of their decisions.
And this really brings us to the powerful conclusion drawn from this history. Just acknowledging that these crimes happened isn't the hardest part. The real danger lies in the belief that holding a position of power somehow puts you above the law, that you're exempt from any real consequence.
And this leaves us with one final, absolutely crucial question. The historical record is crystal clear. When power goes unchecked, these patterns repeat. So the question really isn't about what happened in the past, but what we decide to do in the future. What kind of systems and what kind of will are required to prevent this next chapter from ever being written?